Join me for a conversation with one of the original designers of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. If you don't know, my name is Matt Davis, and I am the author of RPG resource books that help game masters cut down their GM prep time. You can head over to DiceGeeks.com and check some of those out. Or you can find them on Amazon.com or on DriveThruRPG.com. Some of the titles include The Book of Random Tables, Dungeons for the Master, Realms of Understreet, and more. Now, I was able to talk to a veteran of the tabletop RPG industry as well as the video game industry today, so we are going to jump right into the interview. My guest today has extensive credits in the tabletop RPG industry as well as the video game industry. Graeme Davis. Graeme, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, well, this goes back to the late 70s. I just left high school and I was working in a bank, which was a job I absolutely hated. And for a hobby, I joined a local amateur dramatic society. And some of the younger members there had just graduated college where they'd picked up D&D, and they were talking about this game, which was part miniature war game and part improvised theater. And, you know, bear in mind, no one had ever heard of role-playing games at that time, in Britain at least. And I could not figure out how those two things went together. So I decided, well, there's nothing for it. I'll have to go and find out. And so sometime in about 1977, I guess it was, I played my first game of D&D and had two thief characters, both of whom were killed by a minotaur within half an hour. But I was completely hooked, and I've been playing ever since. I went on to college, spent far too much time gaming in college, and became a sort of semi-regular contributor to White Dwarf magazine, run by Games Workshop. It was the main publisher of role-playing games in Britain at that time. And round about 1986, they were looking to do the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game and asked me to come and help them do it. And I've been working in the industry ever since then.
What was the appeal of tabletop role-playing games to you?
Well, initially it was the monsters. I guess I was about 5, maybe 6, when I first saw the old Ray Harryhausen, Jason and the Argonauts on my parents' black and white TV. And all those monsters just amazed me. And I remember the following Christmas asking a rather confused department store Santa for a book on Greek mythology. And it was sort of cemented I guess a few months later when the local mobile library came to my elementary school, and there was a children's retelling of Homer's Odyssey. And that was it. I was hooked on mythology and monsters. You know, so when I was playing D&D for the first time and this Minotaur showed up, that was it.
Though that's interesting to hear. I think I'm finding that a lot of people have been inspired by Ray Harryhausen's films and things like that. So now when you went to school or when you went to university, you studied archaeology. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. What led you into archaeology? I guess your love of mythology?
Yes, it sort of all followed the same meandering path. It was a time and a type of school I went to where you still had to do 2 years of Latin mandatory. And I got very into classical history, during the school holidays, my parents would take me to visit local Roman forts and villas and castles, and because we have that stuff in Britain, and it's never too far away. And so, as time went on, I got more and more interested, and then in the spring of what you would call my senior year of high school. I went on a course during the vacation, which was part classics and part archaeology. I got to explore Hadrian's Wall. We were reading Roman literature in translation, and it was in the city of Durham, which is one of the most beautiful cities you'll ever wish to see in England, and it's been used as backdrops in all manner of films, Harry Potter and various historical epics, especially the cathedral. And I fell in love with the city as well, and I decided, that's it, I'm going to come to Durham, I'm going to study archaeology. Two problems. Durham was one of the better universities in Britain, still is, I think it's number 3 or 4. And I didn't have anything like the grades necessary to do that. The other thing was I hadn't really studied the right subjects. So while I was taking this aforementioned job in the bank, I studied in the evenings ancient history, and managed to get my the required grade to get in, but it took me 3 years to do it.
I'm just thinking of your love for tabletop role-playing games and then your interest in archaeology and mythology. I guess that those just go hand in hand now that you work in the tabletop role-playing game industry.
Yes, it came in sort of handy with most fantasy being pitched at a medieval level of technology. That was something I could understand. And my college gaming group was made up primarily of people who were studying maths and physics. And they were huge science fiction fans, kept trying to talk me into running Traveller. And I thought, no, they could, I'd be out of my depth here with them. Their own D&D campaigns featured things like gigawatt lasers and dimensional travel. And I thought, I just would be completely at the mercy of my players. I'm going to stick with a fantasy setting where I know what's what, and I can keep control of things.
Just kind of picking up with that, fantasy, you were talking about fantasy settings versus kind of sci-fi settings there. Fantasy tabletop role-playing is extremely more popular than science fiction. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on why people, kind of modern-day people, love playing kind of in a pseudo-medieval time period.
No, it's a strange thing. I think perhaps people think as I did, it's kind of a little more familiar, more knowable. I think science fiction fans, there are plenty of very popular science fiction role-playing games going, all the way back to Traveller. But science fiction kind of breaks into so many subgenres, with hard SF and space opera and arguably cyberpunk. And that there was never really a nucleus, whereas fantasy, everybody can sort of gather around Tolkien, Moorcock, Dungeons and Dragons, and although people will vary and play the sort of games and sort of campaigns they like within that, it's not so fragmented.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, because if you say you're playing science fiction, that could mean a number of different things, whereas fantasy, I guess you could say maybe high fantasy or low fantasy, but beyond that, there's not too much variation.
Yeah, that's right. And low fantasy, back at the time I started, hadn't really happened. You could almost say we kind of invented it with WFRP.
Your background in archaeology, and then you started writing. You mentioned it a little bit, but you started writing articles for White Dwarf.
Yes, that's right. Sort of another thread in my life is I was always a frustrated writer, and I wrote a whole bunch of stuff for my school magazine when I was in high school. I usually had the start of a usually pretty bad novel lying in the back of a drawer somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I started playing D&D, again, the monsters thing got me, and I started reading. I got out all my old books on mythology. I ransacked the library. I was looking for ever more obscure monsters to stat up for D&D and throw at my players. And that's something that's continued to this day. But when White Dwarf at that time was published bi-monthly, and it was almost exclusively a role-playing game magazine back then, because Games Workshop had the rights to print D&D, Traveller, and RuneQuest, the big three, in the British market. There was a call. There was always in the letters column people saying, "When are you going to go monthly? When are you going to go monthly?" And the editors were saying, "Oh yeah, we will one day." And then one of the editors, in an unguarded moment, said, "Yeah, we would like to go monthly, but we haven't got the content." So I sort of metaphorically rolled up my sleeves and cracked my knuckles and said, "All right then." And for the next, I think it was 2 years, I was sending them articles. It took me about 2 years to get one in print, but I was sending a couple of articles a month quite regularly. And eventually, Jamie Thompson was the editor's name. He's still active in the industry, I think. He decided that, okay, this kid's clearly not going to go away. And so he published something. And so, and sent me a small check, which, being a good undergraduate student, I immediately converted into beer, and then back to my room to write more. And so it continued for probably about 4 years, until I became one of the more reliable freelancers for White Dwarf, and also for a magazine called Imagine, which was published by TSR UK after they were founded in the 80s. And a lot of their staff ended up moving over to Games Workshop and working on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So since they had a vacancy and I'd proven myself reliable, I guess they thought they'd give me a shot.
You mentioned, this might be a little digression, but you mentioned that you would scour the library for monsters to stat up. What are some of the craziest monsters you statted up to throw at your players?
Well, the wackiest has to be a thing called a Knuckle-a-V.
Okay, I've never heard of that one.
It comes from, I forget whether I think it's Scottish folklore, Western Isles. And it's basically an orca, killer whale, with legs.
Okay.
And growing out the top of its head is a centaur-like torso and upper body and arms and head and that, which has no skin and a demonic visage. And the thing's still got a whale tail at the back, and it's the most bizarre-looking creature.
Yeah, that sounds crazy.
It looks like someone's little brother got in the bits box and decided to make a miniature.
Yeah. No, that is fascinating. You were talking about, how your writing career got started. Just doing some of these interviews on the podcast, I'm just finding that if somebody is kind of mainly a novelist now, that at some point in their life they had played Dungeons and Dragons, and then I find that there's a lot of people who play Dungeons and Dragons who either work in the industry or who want to be writers. And I'm just wondering if there's, I've been trying just to kind of find out, like, what is the connection? Do people who play D&D then decide to become writers later, or just people who want to be writers just take up D&D because it's just another form of storytelling?
I suspect it's a mix of both, varying from individual to individual. But, it's a game of imagination and creativity. So it will attract the sort of people who want to become writers. They're the people with that sort of imagination and creativity will stick with the game and be satisfied by what it offers. And there's just a great overlap, and some will feel driven to write more adventures and backgrounds and settings, and some will go on to actually create novels, sometimes in their own settings and sometimes in others. But yeah, like I say, it's the imagination and creativity of both endeavors that it overlaps quite a lot.
Creative individuals are drawn to this game because it is, or to these games because they are so creative in them of themselves, that the game master is a storyteller, and so somebody like that probably has a bent to writing or storytelling in some way.
Yes, I'd say that's true.
Now, it sounds like that you kind of ended up being the dungeon master most of the time. Is that true?
Yes. Well, yes and no. Obviously, I was just a player in my first few games of D&D, but I wanted early on to create my own dungeons and games, and so I did that with my first group. And then with my college gaming group, just about everybody, we kind of took it in turns. Each of us would run a game, and so I was one of probably 3 dungeon masters at that time.
Okay. No, that's interesting to hear. I know some people kind of get locked into being the game master or the dungeon master all the time, and so that's interesting to hear that you kind of rotated those responsibilities.
Yeah. I mean, it's wrong to talk about campaigns. We were nowhere near that organized, but we would each run one-off games, and then as I started writing for White Dwarf, I used that group as a playtest group for the adventures that I sent them.
Yeah, and you just brought up a good point there. The campaign, playing in like a kind of a formal campaign, was kind of a mythical thing for me in my teenage years and early 20s, because there was just no way we could ever pull off a campaign for more than a couple sessions or anything like that.
Yeah, that's right. And back when I was in my teens and 20s, campaign was a word, and there was a vague concept associated with it, but no one had actually done one, and there weren't any published models to follow. For all that you'd hear about Greyhawk and Blackmoor, there was nothing published for either one at that point. And it wasn't really until the first Dragonlance releases, where the novels and the source books and the ventures were released in parallel, that people started to get the idea of what a campaign actually was, beyond this sort of vague and nebulous concept.
I'm just thinking too, now beyond tabletop role-playing games, you have done a lot of other work. You continue to write books about folklore and things like that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, I've written a few. Osprey did a short-lived series on mythology, and I contributed a couple of volumes to that. And they did what they called Dark Osprey, which was a sort of a mix of folklore, fantasy, and conspiracy. And I wrote books about the Nazi moon base and werewolves and the Knights Templar.
I don't know, just kind of grabbing a topic. If somebody wanted to use the Knights Templar in a role-playing game, do you think that would be a good idea? And how could they do something with that?
Well, certainly that was something that I had in mind when I wrote it. Essentially what I did was I researched every Templar conspiracy theory I could find, put them all together, created an overarching narrative which allowed them all to be true, and then filled in a few gaps. And and I was thinking all along, because I do that, how this would work as a setting for a role-playing game, or for any other form of entertainment. So it would be quite easy to do, in a medieval setting or even in a more modern setting. I brought it up to the present day.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot there that you could.
Oh, there is. Yeah.
Usually anything with kind of like a secret or mysterious society, I think that just kind of lends itself to either the party being members or the party having to battle it.
That's right. Yeah, and it's a ever popular topic. I think it's something that stirs the imagination of gamers, the shadowy secret society.
In addition to your tabletop role-playing games, you've been involved in the video game industry as well. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes. It was, I guess, the early 90s when I worked on my first video game. Discovered very quickly that the video game industry paid far better than the tabletop game industry. particularly in those pre-actual play days. I'm glad to see that there's sort of a renaissance happening in the tabletop industry right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that became my bread and butter. For the next 20 odd years, I worked for an assortment of companies, some freelance, some on staff. The thing I did discover was that as a source of employment, the video game industry is kind of volatile. You know, I've been laid off because projects have been cancelled. I've been laid off because projects have been completed successfully, but no one had planned anything for the team to go on to afterwards. And so it got a little unstable, but I always fell back on, I always had a role-playing game project kind of in the background as well, partly because it's great fun to write for as a form, and partly as well, in large part, because the fans of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay have been so loyal down the years, and that I find that quite humbling, that I just never want to let them down. So, after I left Games Workshop in 1990, I continued to freelance, first for Flame and then for Hogshead for first edition, and then the various later publishers and editions. I always managed to do something. Yeah, it's just something that's always been a part of my life since then.
Now, what video games have you worked on? Just a few, I guess. I've
worked on just over 40 video games in total, but not all of them have been enormous world-shattering hits, as you might imagine. Mm-hmm. I guess the highest profile projects I worked on have been for the Total War strategy game series. I worked on expansion for medieval Total War called Viking Invasion, using my archaeology background again, and also on Empire Total War, which was the 18th century sort of Age of Empire installment in the series. Ironically, I never got to work on Warhammer Total War. And a few years ago, I worked on a number of mobile city builder games for a company called Kabam. And the most successful of those was called Kingdoms of Camelot, Battle for the North. And that became the iTunes Store's top grossing free product across all categories of 2012. Mm-hmm. So there. But mostly it's just been bread and butter stuff. No big hits, no awards. No fortunes made.
Yeah. And now, are you mainly writing and doing narrative design, or what do you do when you work on a video game?
Well, I started out as a game designer because that was a role that was really new in the 90s, because back then people were still making video games in their bedroom, and provided you had an artist and a programmer, that was all you needed. Yeah, when I first joined Microprose back in '94, I think it was, the role of a game designer was just being kind of hammered out as to what it would mean within the video games industry. Mm-hmm. And that has gone on and become deeper and more complex and developed specializations and technical requirements. And so over the last 10 to 15 years, I've specialized more and more as a writer and narrative designer.
I should have probably realized it, but more and more as I do more interviews, I'm realizing that just what the crossover there is, how much crossover there is between the tabletop role-playing game industry and the video game industry. I'm finding that there are a number of people who either started in tabletops and went to video games, or do kind of have done both simultaneously throughout their careers.
Oh, yes. Almost everyone I've known down the years from the tabletop game industry has done at least some work in the video game industry, and some have gone on to do much greater things, like Ken Rolston and Lawrence Schick, working on the Elder Scrolls and Neverwinter Nights, I think, as storytellers and lore masters, keeping the world information straight.
And like I said, as now that I think about it, it makes it makes absolute sense why that would be the case. Since even though the technology in that separates the two, quite a bit, there are a lot of similarities with world building and history elements that need to be brought in to tell a story.
Yes, that's right. Particularly the world building and arranging of the story beats.
People who are not writers, or that, what would be a story beat? How would you explain that?
You know how a drama breaks down into acts and scenes? A story beat is sort of a transition point where the story takes a turn. The protagonist discovers something, and that enables them to move on in a new direction. It's one of the dots that the story connects. That's probably the best way to describe it.
Okay. No, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that. I think sometimes, we'll get into talking about game design or something like that, and we'll leave some people behind, sadly. And so I think it's good to kind of explain some things as we kind of move along.
That's true. And yeah, the industry, like any industry, has its own jargon. And after a while, you get to forget whether or not notice when you're talking jargon or when you're talking plain English.
Yeah. You have, since you have worked on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay so much, maybe could you just, if somebody is not familiar, or they've heard the name, or they've seen the books around or something like that, could you just give kind of just a brief description of what that is? And then maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yes, certainly. Well, it's a tabletop role-playing game, just as Dungeons and Dragons is. Has a very different tone, though. Technologically, it's set a little bit later. It's sort of early Renaissance, so we've got crude black powder weapons in addition to magic. And its tone is grubbier, darker, and more cynical. So back in the post-punk 80s, when we were designing the game, we poured all of our frustrations at D&D into creating Warhammer. I think it's fair to say we got a little tired of black and white morality, chrome-plated armor, masses of back-combed blonde hair, and perfect teeth. We'd grown up watching things like Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Jabberwocky, and reading comics like Judge Dredd. And so it has more in common, I think, with, to use a modern reference, with something like The Witcher, than with the Hollywood Middle Ages of the 50s, 60s, and 70s upon which Dungeons and Dragons was based. Mm-hmm. And in play, that sort of works out that you start at the bottom and you'll probably finish at the bottom. But if you survive, that's a win. Among the playable character classes, we have Ratcatcher, and you can maybe, if you're lucky and resourceful, work your way up to become a knight or a noble. But along the way, there's a lot of threats to face, not only from the powers of chaos, who are the main enemy in the game, and the various monsters, but also from people, unscrupulous people, evil people, people just trying to get ahead. It's very much a dog-eat-dog sort of world.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think you had such a reaction, like, against some of the things in Dungeons and Dragons, or kind of the Hollywood middle age type representation?
Well, two reasons, I think. The most important one is that most of us knew that the Middle Ages weren't at all like that. I had an archaeology degree. Rick Priestley, one of the creators of the whole Warhammer IP, also had an archaeology degree. Several of others of our colleagues had studied history extensively through their interest in historical tabletop wargaming. Mm-hmm. And so the sort of shiny, colorful, sanitized Hollywood version of Britain's Middle Ages, as I might say, struck us a bit amiss. And we found it a little sort of facile and simplistic, and we wanted something a little sort of grimier and grubbier and, like I say, more post-punk, I guess.
So you mentioned a little bit about how kind of the grimier world affects play a little bit. If somebody is new to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and they come into it, what kind of things that should they expect in an adventure or a campaign that might be a little different from another fantasy RPG that they've played?
Probably the single most important difference is the theme of corruption. Chaos, like all evil, starts out by being a sort of a shortcut. You know, you're just going to break the rules this one time, and that's the beginning of the slippery slope. And the powers of chaos address different human frailties. It's possible to get quite metaphysical about them, but we have Khorne, the blood god, who's a patron of rage; Slanesh, the prince of pleasure; Nurgle, the plague father; and then Tzeentch, a more enigmatic god who promises magical power and rewards ambition. So he's more of a sort of a Faustian sort of patron, you might say. And so they prey on human frailties. And the name of the iconic campaign from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is The Enemy Within, and that's a major theme through the whole game. Is yes, you've got the hordes of chaos warriors and mutants and what have you gathering on the borders as you see in the Warhammer battle game. But in the role-playing game, chaos is also active inside human towns and cities. There are cultists to root out, Call of Cthulhu style. There are plots to corrupt and subvert the people in power, and things like that. And so that's a big difference from D&D, where it's always kind of been, you've got the good races and the evil races and the monsters, and there's, in most campaigns, I won't say all, but in most campaigns there's been a fairly hard line between the two, whereas Warhammer is almost all grey area.
That I think that does help kind of help the distinction there. And now also, would you say that there's a difference between the magic as well, or like kind of like usually people associate, high fantasy with lots and lots of magic? Is there a difference with maybe less magic or something like that?
I think the truthful answer to that is yes and no. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has always pitched itself as a low fantasy game. But there is magic, and it's possible to get quite powerful. And as the main Warhammer IP has developed over the last 30 years, it's grown more towards high fantasy and particularly powerful and destructive magic on the battlefield. And Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has kind of followed along with that. That said, magic certainly isn't within the reach of everybody. You can't always, most people can't afford to hire a wizard, just as most people in the Middle Ages couldn't afford to hire the services of a physician. And they're very much the same sort of professional class type people. So yeah, if you're rich and noble, then you can have access to magic. And if you manage to get an apprenticeship, you can start off learning a little bit of magic. And there's plenty of magic in the world, but it's not evenly distributed. Let's put it that way.
Maybe just, again, for people who are not familiar, what would separate Warhammer from Dungeons & Dragons kind of system-wise?
The current 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a percentage-based system. And the core mechanic is basically attribute and skill checks rolled on percentage dice. And so that's a difference, I think, from Dungeons and Dragons still being D20 based. A minor one. There are more classes in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but each one has 4 levels. And you can switch between them pretty much with quite a bit of freedom. It's not a class isn't something you take at character creation and maybe you can multiclass, maybe you can't, but you follow it through your whole career. You can, in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you can start out as a rat catcher. If circumstances and the GM are amenable, you can switch and maybe become a wizard's apprentice or a soldier and then go down that course, and then switch to something else later on. So rather than just following one course and the metric being what level you are and how much experience you've got, in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you have much more freedom to design a character or to take advantage of training opportunities and career changes that come along as the story of your campaign unfolds.
I guess there's always a little bit of a tension between, are you already the hero or are you the person who's, the rat catcher? Are you the person who's just like trying to, are you the peasant farm boy who now becomes an adventurer, or are you already a kind of hardcore adventurer? I think there's always kind of a tension between games trying to kind of figure those things out.
Yeah, that's right. And we've one of the characteristics of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has always been the idea that most characters will start at the very bottom, and then they if they make the most of their opportunities, and if they're lucky and tough, then they can go on to almost anything.
Kind of always a tension between those. I know running a lot of games, I always find that there are certain players who are like, no, I want to be the lowly thing and then develop into an adventurer. And then there are players who are like, I just want to be the adventurer. I just want to be, I just want to be Mad Max day one, or I just want to be whatever day one,
Yeah. Absolutely. I find, perhaps I'm not being fair to Dungeons and Dragons in this regard, but I find, a 7th level fighter is a 7th level fighter is a 7th level fighter with, not much variation between different characters of the same level in the same class. Whereas with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there is no limit on the variations.
Because somebody could have been a rat catcher and then become a fighter, and somebody could have been a wizard's apprentice and then become a fighter.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Graeme, I've had you on here for a long time. I could still keep asking you many more questions, but I want to respect your time. Where can people learn more about you and find out some more about your work?
Okay, well, I have a blog which I keep updated fairly regularly. That's at graemedavis.wordpress.com. I tweet as @GraemeJDavis, and I also have a Facebook page. So you can find me on any of those.
Okay, and then I will be sure to provide links for all of those in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So all the listeners can head over to dicegeeks.com and they will find links to your website and to your social media in the show notes for this episode. So Graeme, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. And in parting, may I just plug a new project that I'm starting up?
Yeah, absolutely.
With a number of very talented people from the tabletop games industry. It's called The Rookery. It has been described as a tabletop RPG supergroup. We are not ready to announce what we're doing yet, but you can find out in due course by following on Twitter @RookeryP. And there is also a Facebook group called The Rookery. And news will be published there as soon as we're ready to reveal what it is we're up to. But it's very exciting. It's going to be a great project, and we're very happy to be working together as a crew, and we're going to have a lot of fun, and we hope that people will enjoy the result.
No, that sounds awesome, and I will definitely put a link to those pages in the show notes for the episode as well. No, that is exciting. So again, just Graeme, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you for having me. I've enjoyed talking with you.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this interview with Graeme. As I mentioned in the interview, I have linked up a lot of the products and the role-playing games, books that Graeme has worked on. So please head over to dicegeeks.com and check out the show notes for this episode. You can find all of those there. Trust me, you want to check some of these out. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps, plus you'll never miss an episode of this show. Now, guys, if you enjoy these episodes that I record for you each and every Wednesday, then please consider supporting the show in some way. One way you can do that is by leaving a review wherever you are listening to this show. You can also tell a friend about the podcast. You could share it on your social media if you like a certain interview. You could also support the show financially by going to patreon.com/dicegeeks and checking out the different ways you can support the show there. Any little bit of support for this show is greatly, greatly appreciated by myself. I love being able to bring these fascinating guests and their knowledge to share with you each and every week, and I cannot do that without your support. So I just thank you so much for listening today, and until next time, keep gaming.